Actually, given some of the goings on in the world, I think maybe we will jump right into Canto 18. I was going to do something else first, but maybe we'll open with Canto 18 because uh, the sort of principal insight from the Hell Cantos of Ezra Pound is you might have seen it in big bold letters, and here the personnel changes. Hell doesn't change, it's just the personnel of it. And a lot of the earth is really, quite hellish. And I think Canto 18 is where we start to see in more detail or depth some of the forces out there. And this is not a sexy canto. Many of the cantos you look at and you just don't know what to do with the names, the historical detail. But let's start with a little bit of translation from Marco Polo with a glimpse of China and then move back into the present of the 1920s. I wonder if you can increase the size of that slightly, Paul, so it can be read a little better.
Yeah, just give me a second here. I've got so many things open, so just okay. I'm going to go to view, go to zoom, go to, oh, that's a little too large. Um, just one second, zoom to, nope, that's not what I want. So zoom, and that's not what I want either. So let me just see if I can do it. Yeah, there we go. Is that right? Or
Great.
about, there we go.
That's great. Right there is great. Yeah. And I want to remind everybody that Ezra Pound's father, um, from the time that Pound was about a year old until Homer Pound retired, worked at the Philadelphia Mint. And some of Ezra Pound's earliest memories were of men stripped to the waist, shoveling coins into troughs. So coinage, money was deep in Ezra's psyche. And that's where we're going to begin with Canto 18. As I said, translation from Marco Polo. And of Kublai. I have told you of that emperor's city in detail, and will tell you of the coining in Kambaluk that hight the secret of alchemy. Stop there a moment. Kambaluk is actually Confucius's hometown, um, and but notice this sort of old-fashioned language that hight the secret of alchemy, that holds or contains or that is known as the secret of alchemy. They take bast of the mulberry tree, that is a skin between the wood and the bark, and of this they make paper and mark it half a tornacle, or a half groat of silver, or 2 groats, or 5 groats, or 10 groats, or for a great sheet, a gold bezant, 3 bezants, 10 bezants, and they are written on by officials and smeared with the great Khan's seal in vermilion, and the forgers are punished with death. And all this costs the Khan nothing. And so he is rich in this world. And his postmen go sewed up and sealed up, the coats buttoned behind and then sealed in this way from the voyage's one end to its other. And the Indian merchants arriving must give up their jewels and take this money in paper. That trade runs in bezants to 400,000 a year, and the nobles must buy their pearls, thus Messer Polo, prison at Genoa, of the emperor. Quick note that Marco Polo put together his account of his travels to China while he was in prison in Genoa for various reasons, including people thought he was lying about what he had seen in China, but this is part of his description. The nobles must buy their pearls of the emperor. There was a boy in Constantinople, and some Britisher kicked his arse. I hate these French, said Napoleon, aged 12, to young Bourrienne. I will do them all the harm that I can. In like manner, Zenos Mitevsky. Quick gloss here. Zenos Mitevsky was one of the big arms dealers of the 1920s. And Ezra Pound was investigating him in the way that Allen Ginsberg picked up many years later to investigate CIA running of guns and running of drugs. So this is back to Pound's voice. In like manner, Zenos Mitevsky. And old Beers was out there, a greenhorn, to sell cannon, and Mitevsky found the back door. And old Beers sold the munitions. And Mitevsky died and was buried, i.e., officially, and sat in the Yiner Cafe watching the funeral. About 10 years after this incident, he owned a fair chunk of Humbers. Humbers is actually a fake name Pound put in for the real name of Vickers, which was a munitions company. So he owned a fair chunk of Vickers. Peace? Peace, said Mr. Giddings. Universal? Not while you got 2 billions of money, said Mr. Giddings, invested in the manufacture of war machinery. How I sold it to Russia. Well, we took him a new torpedo boat, and it was all electric, run it all from a little bit of a keyboard, about like the size of a typewriter. And the prince come aboard, and he says, would you like to run her? And he run damn slam on the breakwater and bust off all her front end. And he was, my God, scared out of his panties. Who was a going to pay for the damage? And it was my first trip out for the company. And I says, Your Highness, it is nothing. We will give you a new one. And my Christ, the company backed me. And did we get a few orders? So La Marquesa de las Zojas y Urbara used to drive up to Sir Zanos's place in the Champs-Élysées and preside at his dinners. And at Lazance, she drove away from the front door with her footman and her coachman in livery and drove 4 blocks round to the back door. And her husband was the son of a bitch. And Mitevsky, the well-known philanthropist, or the well-known financier, better known, as the press said, as a philanthropist, gave, as the SD to Louis XI, a fine pair of giraffes to the nation, and endowed a chair of ballistics, and was consulted before the offensives. And Mr. Oige was very choleric. In a first class from Nice to Paris, he said, danger. Now, a sailor's life is a life of danger. But a mine, why, every stick of it was numbered. And one time we missed one, and there was 300 men killed in the explosion. He was annoyed with the strikers, having started himself as engineer and worked up, and losing by that coal strike some months after the paragraph. Sir Zenos Mitevsky has been elected president of the Gethsemane Trebizond Petrol. And then there came out another 80 locomotives on the Manchester Cardiff have been fitted with new oil burning apparatuses, large stocks of the heavier varieties of which, i.e., oil, are now on hand in the country. So I said to the old Quaker Hamish, I said, I'm interested. And he went putty colored and said, he don't advertise. No, I don't think you will learn much. That was when I asked about Mitevsky Melchizedek. He, Hamish, took the tractors up to King Menelik, 3 rivers and 140 ravines. Qu'est-ce qu'on pense? I said, on don't pense. They're solid bone. You can amputate from just above the medulla, and it won't alter the life on that island. But he continued, mais qu'est-ce qu'on pense de la métallurgie en Angleterre? Qu'est-ce qu'on pense de Mitevsky? And I said, They ain't heard his name yet. Go ask at McGorvish's bank. The Jap observers were much amused because the Turkish Freemasons hadn't bothered to take the regimental badges off their artillery. And old Hamish, Menelik had a hunch that machinery and so on, but he never could get it to work, never could get any power. The Germans would send them up boilers, but they'd have to cut them into pieces to load them on camels, and they never got them together again. And so old Hamish went out there and looked at the place, 3 rivers and 140 ravines, and he sent out 2 tractors, one to pull the other, and Menelik sent down an army, a 5,000 black army with hawsers, and they all sweated and swatted. And the first thing Dave lit on when they got there was a buzz saw, and he put it through an ebony log. 2 days' work in 3 minutes. War, one war after another. Men stardom who couldn't put up a good hen roost. Also, sabotage. Well, let's come back to the full screen, Paul. Any of you who've paid attention to the various moves in more contemporary poetry to try to document the collusion of bankers and munitions manufacturers, this is the point at which people began to read Pound seriously for that sort of thing. And there's a movement back and forth here between this guy Matevsky and various other little anecdotes about munitions and the banks. In a way, a key of it is when Pound has presumably himself saying of Matevsky, they ain't heard his name yet. Go ask at McGorvish's bank. In other words, the bankers know the munitions guys, but most people haven't heard of them. All they've read is that they're great financiers, they're great philanthropists. It's funny, I was recently, checking into some John le Carre books, and it's the same thing, top to bottom there. But let's just hold on to that for a moment. This is going to become, a theme more and more important in the cantos, a term that I sort of, use with reserve as like metaphysics. If there's like a real metaphysics behind the cantos, it's got to do with economics, the way money works, who controls the money, and then how the money is in collusion with the munitions manufacturers. And I think this is one of the things that makes, for me, this book a great anti-war poem. And one of the books to go back to again and again and again is that constant reminder that through history, this collusion of people who make money, the bankers, and I think that little moment at the end there where we see somebody named Dave getting hold of a buzzsaw and cutting through a log, and as Pound says, 2 days' work in 3 minutes. There's a sense there that Pound's trying to contrast once again productive machinery that actually helps people versus destructive machinery, which is coming out of the collusion of banks and munitions manufacturers. And then that, I find remarkable ending, one war after another, men stardom who couldn't put up a good hen roost. So, I'm actually thinking now of you, Daniel, out there setting up your woodworking shop. We still have a situation where men are putting up wars who don't know how, which end of a hammer to hold, but they sure know which end of a bank account to wield. So these are the things that kind of, have caught me continuously. And I think, that particular canto, I would say, would be a governing force between certainly Allen Ginsberg and others who have tried to use poetry as a way of exploring, the movements of history and who's wielding power and why wars happen. I think we've come a long way from Canto 1, where we have the golden, we had Aphrodite wielding the golden bow of Argosidia, In other words, love is the one that is destroying the Greeks. I think Pound, at that point may have sort of subscribed to that old, almost like Freudian notion that war is just sex gone bad. But in fact, now he's starting to see, no, it's not that. It's not just some unexplained flaw in human condition. It's a real collusion between people who know what they're doing. Um, so now I want to just break a moment. I can't remember who it was. I think it was either Roxy or maybe Anne who asked me yesterday, would I say something about how I got into this? Was that you,
Yeah.
Roxy, who
Yeah, I mean, it was, and I just wanted to add a little bit to that. I was in a class yesterday. Sorry about my dogs. Oh my God, of course. I was in a poetry group with Andrei Codrescu, and somehow the Eliot versus Pound wars were brought up. And Codrescu said that he felt that Pound was more relevant to future generations because his way of presenting the past enabled us to engage with it in a future focused way, like he's teaching us new languages and so forth. Whereas Eliot clearly found that greatness was relegated to the past. And that kind of reminded me of what Nietzsche said about monumental history and the importance of forgetting classical history so that we can move on into the future. And I just admire you for carrying the Pound torch, I guess, into the future with so many classes, us, for example. So my two questions were, what do you see as important with Pound and revisiting him in the future? And you're starting to answer that now with the documentary Poetics and the War and Munitions and that history, but also how is he important to your poetry? And those are huge questions that can be answered later if you prefer, or bits here and there.
Well, I thought
That's
maybe I
too much.
would sort of touch on the second one. I think the first one, will unfold as we go on through the cantos, but I thought it might be interesting just to say, where did this come from for me? And especially since you were there in Santa Cruz, right? You're at Santa Cruz, right? So,
Yes, you mean with all the protests that are shutting down our campus around
oh
Hamas and
no, I
Israel?
wasn't
Oh,
even
no.
addressing that.
Oh,
I was just going to
oh,
say,
because you were, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I went to UC Santa Cruz.
Right,
That's where I
okay.
got my undergraduate degree. And in 1974, I had sort of gotten to UC Santa Cruz because I was really interested in this Coyote Man scholar, really like a shamanic, uh, like sort of outcast who didn't really fit in anywhere, but was acknowledged to be brilliant. And Santa Cruz set a snare for him. Yeah, that was Nobby or Norman O'Brown. Santa Cruz set a snare called History of Consciousness. They created a department that they knew Pound couldn't, refuse. So this was like, the offer that you can't refuse. And they brought Norman O'Brown to Santa Cruz, to UC Santa Cruz. And I had been had forced into my hand or placed in my hand Nobby's Love's Body, and I thought by a professor at Berkeley, and I thought I've got to go find out who this guy is. So I transferred down to Santa Cruz, and I signed up for a class that was just called Introduction to Poetry, and the book that was very important to me, we had two textbooks for Nobby's class. We met out in a little meadow out behind Stevenson College, surrounded by redwoods and madronia trees and that. And one of the books was Jerome Rothenberg's anthology, America Prophecy, um, which is still in print. I don't think many people read it much anymore, and so for good reasons. But it was in that book that I found about 18 chunks of Ezra Pound, including four full cantos, and quite a few little fragments of things that Pound had said. As one of the epigrams for that book, I cited it wrong. I'm sorry on the structure and themes of the cantos. These are these like phrases that you've known so long you never go back to check whether you remembered them right or not. But as one of the epigrams of the book, Pound says, "It is dawn at Jerusalem while midnight hovers above the pillars of Hercules. all ages are contemporaneous in the mind. And I think that's what really got me. Not only all ages are contemporaneous in the mind, but that sort of beautiful image of dawn in Jerusalem, and of course the Pillars of Hercules is that point where Spain and Morocco almost meet the mouth of the Mediterranean. That's the pillars there. So it was just such a beautiful image of dawn moving westward across the sky, and one place is dawn, one place is midnight. You could go into it symbolically in any ways you wanted, but little things like that really gripped me enormously. And then I found another quote that I just totally love from Pound also. He said, "We do not know the past in chronological sequence. It may be convenient to lay it out anesthetized on the table with dates pasted on here and there. But what we know by ripples and spirals eddying out from us and from our own time." I loved what you said, Roxy, about the argument Pound versus Eliot. That sentence actually makes a little bit of a mockery of T.S. Eliot's poem, the one that begins, when evening is laid out against the sky like a patient etherized upon the table. So we do not know the past in chronological sequence. It may be convenient to lay it out anesthetized on the table with dates pasted on here and there. But what we know by ripples and spirals eddying out from us and from our own time. So that's as good a definition of vorticism as I could think of, these ripples and spirals moving out from our own time. But so, I think of all the work that I found in America Prophecy, there was great work by all sorts of now even forgotten, wild American modernists and people. But some point around that time, I went up to Berkeley and I saw, at that time, Moe's Books was not in its present location. It was next door to where it is now, in what eventually became the reprint mint, and I think is now under renovation, this whole space there. But Moe's Books, he went downstairs, and the back wall had their poetry section, a big selection of poetry, and they had this big hardback with an orange cover on it that just said the Cantos. And I thought, man, I'd love to know that book. I would really love to know it. But it looked so daunting, and it was also really expensive. It was $25. And in 1970, like say four or five, $25 was a lot to pay for a book. But, strangely enough, within a year or two, my mother came to the Bay Area to visit, and we were having coffee at the Cafe Mediterranean across the street from Moe's Books. And I sort of wheedled my mother and I said, "Do you want to do something really nice for me? Something just like this would really further my studies. Would you by any chance go across the street and buy me that copy of Ezra Pound's Cantos? It's on the shelf there." And she did. So I owe to my mother my original version, or my original, book of the Cantos. And and then what happened is a couple of years later, I went up to Berkeley to study Sanskrit, and I thought, I might end up in Sanskrit studies doing something or other. And there was a class being taught on Ezra Pound's Cantos, and I wheedled again, and I got my advisor at Berkeley to agree to let me take this graduate seminar in Ezra Pound's Cantos with a brilliant guy. He's dead now, named Michael Andre Bernstein, but he claimed to know 90% of the references in Ezra Pound's Cantos. And he was a good guide. He was very, very helpful. And I think it was then that I discovered a poetry that could use many voices and move in and out of time periods. And really important, place translation at the heart of the project of writing poetry. I felt now my whole life that Um, there's nothing undignified about poets who don't bother to learn another language and don't translate. I mean, just writing poetry is enough. But there is something remarkable about poets who put translation at the center of their project. And I think in particular of, Pound himself, his colleague H.G., of a more modern generation that I was really cutting my teeth on, Gary Snyder, Denise Levertov, Jack Hirschman, Robert Duncan. I mean, all these poets who really took translation as integral, not as something separate from the poetry as it went. Um, so then I continued to do Sanskrit, but began to find, as much as I loved the Sanskrit, it was way more fun to have a life out on the street being a poet. And so, in many ways, it was Pound who shifted me from being in South Asian languages and literatures and moving in a different direction. I kept up with the Sanskrit, and I years later found an interview with Robert Duncan where he said a wonderful thing. He said, many poets, I don't remember exactly how he put it, but he said something like, many poets identify very strongly with another cultural or another historical period. And he may have even suggested that there was reincarnation involved. And again, I would sort of, I just made a little list here, those of us who are familiar with them. In some ways, Gary Snyder is nothing but a Tang Dynasty poet who was reborn in, mid-century, mid-20th century America. Diane de Prima is nothing but a 19th century Italian anarchist poet who was reborn in New York City. Robert Duncan, clearly a medieval Gnostic, balancing between Christianity and neo-paganism. And in the same way, Ezra Pound is probably an 11th or 12th or 13th century, either Provençal or Tuscan poet, reincarnated shortly after World War I to pull together all the material that he could find from that place. These are the kind of things that kept me interested, that ability to layer time periods, the ability to recognize that time doesn't happen for us chronologically. We move in and out of it. Many of us know what it feels like to be 21st century and yet long to be a 19th century anarchist in Italy, to be 20th century and step towards the mountains and be a Tang Dynasty poet, to, step out, see cherry blossoms, and suddenly we're contemporaries of Basho, or Li Qingqiao, or, so I found this kept me coming back again and again and again. And, what I had seen in Rothenberg's anthology and a few other places was the readily anthologized cantos, which are mostly paradise cantos. And there's no doubt that those are deeply beautiful, but they amount for just a little bit of the cantos. So my question was, what's the rest of this stuff? What is all this mess in there? Foreign languages, phrases in foreign languages, Chinese ideograms, Egyptian hieroglyphs, long stretches of Chinese history, quotations from letters of people, rapid shifts of voice, rapid shifts of time and place, people I've never heard of, crusaders. I had no idea what to do with the rest of it. And it's not an easy study, but it's one that, you want, some of us, it just gets under our skin. So now I'll bring things full circle just for one final anecdote that returns to my mother, which is, I knew that I'd had kind of a birth that was unusual in Washington, D.C. And I asked my mother, what hospital was I born in? And she said, oh, you were born in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And that's where Ezra Pound was fucking incarcerated for 17 years in a ward for the criminally insane. So he was upstairs typing out rock drill Cantos, and I was downstairs puking and mewling like any newborn. So that's the old karma. I have a poem where I say, Ezra Pound, there is karma between us. So that maybe brings full circle the question of how I got into this or why I would be into this. I have no idea beyond that.
Oh my God, that was the best answer in the world. I can't imagine a better one. I'm sure that both Paul and I will want to interview you after this, as though you have time, right, Paul? Since you're offering this to us, I don't want to be the one to say, "Hey, Andrew." But
You should
that was
you should go for it. You should go for
no,
it.
no, no, no. We'll talk later. But that was beautiful. I was going to ask you if you felt that your work now in Europa, with the Sanskrit background, sort of laying a basis, I guess, for the Hinduism, laying a basis for Mahayana Buddhism, which is there where you are, was part of your reincarnated karma, as it were. But your story about Saint Elizabeth is even better. But
Yeah,
at some point, I'd like to hear about
I
your
was
Naropa
probably a
connection too.
I was probably a Sanskrit erotic poet in 8th century India. Who knows? I don't know. But yeah, at a time when Mahayana Buddhism was on its ascendancy. But um, yes, so anyhow, that, we can delve into that further, but that's enough to give you an idea of what brought me into this and, my ongoing, just sort of fascination with this particular book. But I realize I want to, speak to one other thing, which I've mentioned now a number of times. Ezra Pound being incarcerated at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And I think last I spoke of, when I gave an earlier synopsis of his life up until the beginning of the Cantos, we really ended up in the ruins of World War One. Ezra Pound having, as he puts it, removed himself from that barbaric island of England to Paris. And I think it's worth getting, especially since we're going to lay off for several weeks here, just for everybody to have a little bit of a synopsis, briefly told, of Ezra Pound's life so that you know where to situate some of the cantos as you read them. So when Ezra Pound was in the early 1920s in Paris, it was probably a cultural revolution or a renaissance that was beyond his wildest imaginings and beyond, I think, what any of us have ever experienced. If you think of all the movements in painting, music, literature, poetry, novels that were happening in Paris, and all the people who lived there, and the sort of, central location of Shakespeare and Company books with, just an endless parade of modernists from Russia, Italy, Spain, France, America. I think it sounds like utterly exhilarating and pretty exhausting in a way. And Pound seems to have been introduced to the little tourist town in northern Italy, Rapallo, by his friend William Butler Yeats, who said, when you need to get out of Paris, you ought to come down to Rapallo and you can swim and play tennis and eat Italian food and, not be in the thronging center of everything. Paris may have been too much of a vortex for Ezra Pound. So he moved down to Rapallo and lived there from about 1922 or 23 in a little kind of penthouse apartment. I mean, to say penthouse is to, use like a kind of post-World War II metaphor. It was just the top level of a building. He had an apartment on close to the seashore in Rapallo, which is northern Italy, on the western coast. And while living there, uh, Pound wrote cantos. He built his own furniture. He was quite good with his hands at all sorts of things. He played a lot of tennis. He entertained a number of well, quite a flow of Americans in particular who had seen his cantos and thought, I've got to go talk to this man. So he had what he referred to and others referred to as the Ezuversity, which was effectively young Americans who would show up and go hang out with Ezra Pound, and he would often read to them from the daily newspaper in Italian, and then talk about the armaments and the banks and the sort of clear movement in Europe rearming itself for another world war to occur, but all sorts of cultural things too. And I want to make this relatively compressed, but when Ezra Pound got that copy of the early 16 cantos, he knew they were quite obscure. I just found a wonderful quote he translated. I'm not even sure who it's from, but of a 12th century Tuscan poet talking about another poet saying, this troubadour is so good, so beyond any of us. In fact, his verses are so subtle that almost nobody can figure out what he's saying. And I think that's what Ezra Pound began to figure out about his cantos. It may be good, it may be subtle, but almost nobody can figure out what is being said there. And he could not have helped at that point noticing and being subject to the enormous propaganda coming out of the Mussolini machine. Mussolini had taken over Italy, instituted a kind of form of government that came to be called fascism. But up until that point, nobody really had ever heard of fascism. And Ezra Pound was a committed opponent of what he saw as capitalism and free market capitalism because it led to war. He was sure that collusion of bankers and munitions people, and the sense that there would never be a time without war as long as there was free market capitalism and all that money to be made out of the machinery of the weaponry of warfare. And in those days, really the two alternatives would have been something like communism, something that was going on in Stalinist Russia, or something like fascism, which was going on in Mussolini's Italy. And Pound wanted to check out this guy, Mussolini, and then he made what I like to call his fatal mistake. He asked for an audience with Benito Mussolini and mailed a copy of his first 16 cantos. And he eventually was able to get about a 10-minute interview with Mussolini. He took the train down to Rome, went into the office with Mussolini, who had that initial volume of the cantos laying on his desk. And Ezra Pound said, what do you think of my poetry? And Mussolini gave the standard answer that so many people give to poets. It was very interesting. Ma questo, said the boss, c'est divertissement. In other words, it's very diverting. It's a diverting book. And Pound really misunderstood that and thought, this guy understands what I'm driving at. This guy understands my poetry. And after that, he became quite enamored of Mussolini. Most of what he knew was probably propaganda coming out. Mussolini draining the swamps, building low-income housing, getting the trains to move on time. And Pound began to rhyme Mussolini with people like Sigismondo Malatesta, Thomas Jefferson, these various energetic people who were working for the welfare of their people. Um, and as the world moved towards war, Pound could see it more and more. And then he did a very crazy thing in 1939. He was desperately afraid that the United States was going to be pulled into a world war. And in 1939, he went back to the United States, went to Washington, D.C., and tried to get an audience with President Roosevelt. He never got an audience with Roosevelt. He got an audience with a couple of kind of right-wing senators who probably thought Ezra Pound was a crazy old man, but Pound did what he could to try to avert the war and particularly avert American involvement in the war. And he must have sounded like a lunatic because he probably talked like the Cantos read, you know, various layers of history, various personages, multiple voices, and we'll eventually see those in the Cantos. He went back in 1939 quite disheartened by his reception in uh, Congress and, you know, his non-reception at the White House, and ended up back in Rapallo. And sure enough, not only did war break out, but it did a few things. It ended the flow of mail outside of Italy. So Pound stopped getting things like American and British newspapers, communications from his friends. For him personally, maybe more importantly, he had nowhere to get money. His money came from two places. He got a little bit of money from his father, who had retired from the mint, and he got money from writing reviews and things. So he was suddenly kind of cast adrift with his wife, Dorothy, his girlfriend, I guess you could say, Olga Rudge, and money that he was trying to give to his daughter, Mary, or the family that had adopted Mary or taken Mary in up in the Tyrol. So effectively, he had four people to support. Other money that had been coming in was a kind of inheritance of his wife, Dorothy's, but she couldn't get money out of England either because of the war. Italy quickly went to war with England, or rather formed an alliance with Germany, and England, neither mail nor money could flow. So Ezra Pound, not quite knowing what to do for money, and also being at this point, I think personally, probably kind of crazed at, you know, if you scoot back a dozen years to him trying to write a book as an anti-war book and now seeing war breaking out again. I think this was like devastating to his spiritual life, his emotional life, his intellectual life, to all his dreams, which may have been hubristic and nonsensical, but you know, it was quite crushing. Um, he now needed money, though. He managed to contact some people in the government in Rome. And around then, he was beginning to learn the power of radio. And he suggested to them he could maybe get a job going on Rome radio. Of course, Mussolini's government had, what would you say, fascicized? I mean, it's like socialized, but they'd taken over the newspapers, the radios, the trains, the factories. That was what fascism did. And so Pound went to work for effectively Mussolini's government to broadcast radio. And he was told that he would be put on the air and could broadcast to American troops in the trenches. Pound insisted on having a paper drawn up and signing it saying that he was broadcasting his own ideas, he was not being coerced, and that it was simply himself exercising his First Amendment rights as an American citizen, exercising his constitutional rights to speak. And he was going to speak to the American troops in the trenches. I think they've now discovered that he was put on the wrong bandwidth and his broadcast never got to the American troops. But by now, he was being carefully monitored by American intelligence, which recorded many of his broadcasts. So his listeners were basically the predecessors of the CIA and military intelligence, who began to hear things like Ezra Pound saying, what America needs is a Confucian government. But these poor guys were poorly enough educated, they'd never heard of Confucius. So they began to say, this guy's an anarchist. He thinks a Confucian government is what he's calling for in the United States. So Confucian government, he was calling Roosevelt a criminal because he could see Roosevelt gearing up towards war. He was calling out the bankers. He was calling out the munitions people, and he was dropping in and out of periods of history and characters. He quit writing Cantos for this period. I think all his Cantos energy went into his radio broadcasts. And if you listen to any of them, he sounds kind of crazy, but he also sounds like he's reading the Cantos to the CIA. And within all of that, he had enormous anxiety because of the situation of his daughter up in the Tyrol. And I told the story last week of at some point he felt like he needed to go see her, and he walked through war-torn Italy, 400 miles, with in one pocket some bread and cheese some friends had given him, and in the other pocket a bunch of maps that he'd managed to copy, and somehow got from Rome to the Tyrolean Alps and found his daughter, who was working in a German hospital, and had a kind of honest conversation with her. Gave some thought. He was offered some employment because he was an energetic guy of using a pitchfork and feeding the livestock and that sort of thing. But he meanwhile had his wife Dorothy and his girlfriend Olga back down in other parts of Italy, so he went back down there. And now money was a real difficulty, and the German army came in because the Americans and British were landing, and the German army requisitioned his apartment in Rapallo. So he and Dorothy had no place to live, having been displaced by the German military that wanted their armaments on the seacoast of Italy. And the only place to go was to a little kind of artist's hut that Olga had up in the hills above Rapallo at some distance. So Ezra and Dorothy loaded up their suitcases and dragged them up the hill to live with Olga, which must have been a terribly tense period of time, living for a year, Ezra with his wife and his girlfriend. But they somehow, made it, and things worked out pretty quickly. Late in the cantos, you'll see little lines that point to it that, thanks to scholars we've found out about, he'll have a line that says something like, one cooks, one doesn't cook. And that's like a recollection of the tension in the household. Dorothy cooked because she was a householder. Olga didn't cook because she was a bohemian violinist. But it must have been an incredibly tense period of time. And meanwhile, the Americans were marching up. The Americans displaced the German and Italians, or I shouldn't say just Americans, the Allies. And word came to Ezra Pound that there was a warrant out for his arrest. And he went down to Rapallo apparently a couple of times to some American authorities and said, my name's Ezra Pound. I understand that you're looking for me, and I know an awful lot about Italian culture and history and the language because I've been living here for a dozen years, and maybe I could be some service to the American military. And the military officers looked at him and said, "Old man, why don't you go home?" And he went home, and nobody knew who he was or what to do with him exactly. But meanwhile, there was a whole band spearheaded by J. Edgar Hoover, who was taking him very seriously and saying, this man has done treasonous things. And there was a lot of pressure on all of the allies to find collaborators or whatever you want to call them and hang them. The British were doing it. Even the Americans got into the act, sniffing out the Rose of Tokyo or Tokyo Rose, but there were a number of known traitors. And in the wake of World War II, the Allies really liked to make examples of somebody they could prove was a traitor. And so Hoover's newly formed intelligence service was all over Ezra Pound, and word really began to go out. And one day, Olga and Dorothy were both out doing various things. Ezra Pound was sitting in the little cottage at his desk translating Confucius, and there was a knock on the door. He opened the door. There were two Italians who identified themselves as so-called partisans. That meant anti-Mussolini Italians. Pound's daughter thinks they were just common thugs, but they believed that there was some money in capturing Ezra Pound, and they were standing there with little submachine guns, and they said, "You come with us." And Pound reached onto his desk and picked up a Chinese dictionary and put it in one pocket, and a volume of Confucius and put it in the other pocket, and walked out down the lane with these two guys with their machine guns or submachine guns. He turned around, his landlady appeared, and he tossed his key to her. And then he stooped down and picked up a little eucalyptus nib, little seed of the eucalyptus, and put it in his pocket, and walked away from any kind of visibility or documentation for a long, long time. They took him they imprisoned him in a cement room that had one wall covered in blood, where they'd clearly been executing people. And he expected any moment to be, somebody would come in and shoot him. And then he was eventually turned over to American military intelligence. I don't know whether or not these so-called partisans got any money out of him, but he was turned over to the American military intelligence. They didn't quite know what to do, so they telegrammed Washington, D.C. and said, "We have Ezra Pound. What shall we do?" And they got, in a few days, a telegram back saying, "Very important prisoner. Do not let him escape. Do not let him commit suicide. We're finding a place for him." So, of course, Pound's shoelaces were taken away and whatever else. And then eventually he was shipped out to Pisa, where there was a camp. They called it DTC, a detention training camp. It was primarily for American GIs who had been accused of crimes. Most of them were deserters. Some of them were murderers. Some of them were rapists. Some of them were looters. But these were all American military accused of crimes. Pound was driven up to the Pisan DTC. And at the DTC, they had just been told a very important prisoner under no circumstances let him escape. And at the DTC, they had a row of cages. The cages were about 7 feet tall, about 12 feet deep, about 4 feet wide. They were a lot smaller than you would ever see, let's say, a lion or a tiger in a zoo. These were little cages, and there was a row of them, and this was death row. and in each of the cages was an American military personnel who was going to be hung for whatever crime they'd been accused of. And at the end cage, when Pound arrived, the military officials there, knowing they had a very important prisoner not to be allowed to escape, had reinforced this end cage with supporting steel bars and put Klieg lights on it day and night. So Pound was put in a cage with no shelter from the Tuscan sun and wind and chill at the night and the rain, and no opportunity to really sleep because there were lights on him all night long. And everybody in the camp was under orders not to speak to him, so nobody would talk to him. And he was 60 years old, 60, 61 years old. And within several weeks, he began to break down, and they gave him a little pup tent that he could pitch inside of his cage. And he managed to find scraps of paper and picked up writing the cantos. And then he collapsed physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and was carried into the medic's tent. His eyes were almost no good. They were burnt out by the Klieg lights and the hot sun and the alternations of weather and everything. And the medics treated his eyes, and maybe more important, treated him kindly and kind of liked him, and basically let him hang out with them in the medic's tent during the day. And he would go back into his little pup tent in the cage at night, but he would come in and spend the day in the medic's tent, and they let him use their medic tent typewriter. And he wrote the piece on Cantos. And he lived there for 7 months, watching other prisoners in those cages taken out and out to a gallows that was inside of where he was and hung. So every single day he realized might be his last day, that any moment he expected the cage would be opened and he would be taken out and hung, as were these various people. Most of them, interestingly, were African American or Black American GIs, and a number of them appear in the piece on Cantos, and they all seem to have liked him and treated him kindly. There's a very moving point at which one of them builds him a little writing table and says, "Don't you tell nobody I built that table for you." And another point at which other prisoners dig a little trench around his cage so that the rains at night won't flood him out. So he seems to have been liked there and made what he could of 7 months living in a cage and during the day using a typewriter. And then one day, as he was expecting, a Jeep with several marshals pulled into the detention center, and Marshall stepped out, pointed at him, and said, "Get your bag. You've got 10 minutes. We're leaving." And Pound turned to one of the guards in the detention center, who he'd become friendly with, and put his hands up at his throat and made a little jerk and climbed in the Jeep and disappeared again. Now, in the time he was at the detention camp, eventually his wife, Dorothy, and found out where he was. And she eventually managed to occasionally hitchhike and catch rides with GI trucks up to visit Pound briefly. His daughter was forbidden to visit because she wasn't considered his daughter, as I outlined last week. The paternity, on the birth certificate being given to somebody else, the paternity. Eventually, I think she was able to visit once as a relative. But again, after 7 months of kind of knowing where Ezra Pound was in this cage, he disappeared off the face of the earth again. They drove him to Rome, put him on a military plane, secretly refueled on the Canary Islands. They needed to be kind of out of any national territory except controlled by the United States. And they flew him back to Washington, D.C. to stand trial for treason. By the time he got back to D.C., he was pretty broken down. And one of the first things they did was they had military psychologists interview him. And the psychologists thought he was out of his mind. He was talking like the Cantos read or something. He was trying to explain himself. He was trying to say how he was using his First Amendment right. He was trying to explain to them the collusion of bankers and munitions people and why World War II was faked up to make money for the wealthy, and how Roosevelt had fallen for the ruse. And the psychologists turned to the lawyers, or really the prosecuting attorney, and said, this guy cannot understand the charges brought against him. He is not fit to stand trial. And Ezra Pound was remanded to a ward for the criminally insane at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where he lived for the next 17 years. Couple of quick last things. He hadn't been there very long in the ward at St. Elizabeth's. Now picture it, this is the ward for criminally insane. So there are serial killers, people who are receiving lobotomies. It's a locked ward with guards there. It's a tough place probably to be. And he lived there for 17 years. He had not been there very long when, as part of the reconstruction of America, a big prize was put together for a literary prize called the Bowling Prize. And this was highly popularized. And this was going to really bring, America back to the forefront of the arts. And whoever was on the governing body of the Bowling Prize, or the judges, awarded the prize to Ezra Pound for the piece on Cantos, which well deserve it. When we get to the piece on Cantos, they are unutterably moving, but you need to have gone through the rest of the cantos first. So clearly there were some well-read people on the prize there. And this was almost enough to destroy the Bowling Prize. I mean, you don't give the prize to somebody who's in a ward for the criminally insane, who many people think should be hung and isn't being hung because he can't understand the charges against him. And I think Robert Duncan said it the most beautifully. This is the perfect image of America. Our greatest poet is locked up in the hospital for the criminally insane. That's the ideogram of America. Matteo, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, thank you so much. Hey, I was just curious, what was Pound diagnosed? I mean, obviously I'm a therapist, so I think he has underlying, narcissism and other personality disorders. And then he had PTSD, but I was wondering how they diagnosed him and what the treatment was while he was there at St. Elizabeth's.
This is not well known. Part of it is, confidential records that people have not been able to get to, and part of it is controversy. The head of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a doctor and I think a psychoanalyst named Oberholzer, seems to have repeatedly signed papers um, uh, uh, basically witnessing that Ezra Pound was not able to understand the charges against him. There were a lot of people who wanted Ezra Pound hung, and years later, this was seen as sort of a scandal that this guy Overholzer had protected a treasonous man, faking up, diagnoses, and keeping him alive. Other people think he was really quite crazy, and they use all the terms schizophrenia and narcissism and all of that. But in fact, there was a sort of pop psychoanalyst named E. Fuller Torrey. Maybe you've heard of him. He's written a bunch of popular books, but he wrote a book in the 1980s accusing the medical service at St. Elizabeth of having shielded a guilty Ezra Pound from the law, and that it was a miscarriage of justice and that Ezra Pound should have been hung for treason. Ezra Pound's friends, of course, thought very differently and were planning to mount a defense saying he was exercising his constitutional rights as an American citizen to speak. And the government's principal charge was not what he said on the radio, but where he said it from. He said it from Mussolini's Rome, the headquarters of the enemy. He was therefore aiding the enemy. The charges they were putting up, trying to pull together, had nothing to do with what Pound said, simply where he was an employee of the Mussolini government. All of this, and Pound's friends got very frustrated because with Pound not having been convicted of a crime, there wasn't even the possibility of a pardon. Mm-hmm. And with a, head of the hospital repeatedly saying the guy's crazy, we can't let him out. He can't go to trial, therefore we can't let him out. And his friends paid attention while he lived at St. Elizabeth's. He was sort of recognized as not much of a threat, so he had lots of visitors there. Dorothy lived in Washington, D.C., and spent every day with him. Young Allen Ginsberg, young W.S. Merwin, young Diane DePrima, as well as hundreds of other young people in a string would go down to visit him and talk to him. And he wrote 2 more books of the Cantos in St. Elizabeth's. Rock Drill and Thrones. Thrones was his effort to write Paradise, finally. If you can imagine a guy locked up by the US government in a hospital for the criminally insane trying to write the Paradiso. And different administrations came and went. Pound's friends tried to get various attorney generals willing to release him, saying he doesn't pose a danger to anybody. He's kind of nuts. Just, send him back to Italy. He can live with his daughter, but there's no reason to keep him there. But the temper of the country was not one that was, any president or, politician was really willing to touch. And finally, during the Kennedy administration, 1962, Archibald MacLeish, a poet who people don't really read much anymore, but had a lot of ins with people at Washington, got a hold of the Attorney General with a long list of signatories, including T.S. Eliot, many of the best known writers of the day. had signed this list as an appeal to release Ezra Pound in the custody of his daughter. And they felt they needed one last person. And they went to Robert Frost. Those of you my age might remember that Robert Frost read poetry for John F. Kennedy's inauguration and sort of the unofficial poet laureate of the United States. And this group of literary people went to Robert Frost and said, please sign this appeal. We would like to free Ezra Pound. And Robert Frost, no doubt in one of those icy hells at the moment, said, I wouldn't touch that document. And Archibald MacLeish said, Mr. Frost, do you recall who wrote that beautiful review of your first book and launched your career? That man was Ezra Pound. And Frost said, I guess I'd better sign the document. And that seems to have pushed the Kennedy administration over the edge, and they released Ezra Pound.
So he wasn't released till 62, not 59, but 62. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and he did a whirlwind tour of a few places in the United States, and then he sailed back for Italy and gave a fascist salute when he got off the boat, which was photographed by journalists. I'm sure he was basically doing it for J. Edgar Hoover. And then he went up and lived for years with his daughter up in the Tyrolean Alps. People came to visit. The BBC took a film crew. They filmed him up there. It got lonely after a while. It was a long way to travel through post-war, or travel in Europe to get to the Tyrolean Alps. And Pound eventually moved south, and he ended his years. He moved in with his girlfriend, Olga Rudge, who still had an apartment in Venice, and lived in Venice and died in Venice, and is buried in Venice and has a gravestone in Venice. He fell into silence for the end of his life. He wrote very little. The late cantos, the drafts and fragments are heartbreaking, I think. Full of contrition, full of remorse. This was the time when he would not speak hardly to anybody. There's a very moving account of Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, and I think is it Gregory Corso or it's somebody else, goes to visit Ezra Pound, and he won't talk to them. And Allen Ginsberg, being Allen Ginsberg, plays in the Beatles singing, reads him Leroy Jones, Amity Baraka, poetry, chitters and chatters to him, and finally says, there's a young generation that is looking to you. You have really taught us to write. And under his breath, apparently, Ezra Pound mutters, a mess. And Allen Ginsberg says, your book or yourself? And Pound says, ruined all because of a stupid suburban prejudice. And he's referring to his anti-Semitism, which runs through some of those wartime cantos or pre-war cantos. And Allen Ginsberg, like a good rabbi, absolves him. He says, I'm so glad to hear that. He puts his hand on the head of the elderly Ezra Pound and blesses him. And, that's about the last really recorded conversation. There are a couple of other times, a historian, an Italian historian visits Ezra Pound or sees him somewhere and says, Mr. Pound, Mr. Pound, where are you living now? And Pound leans on his cane and leans his head forward and whispers, in hell. So there's some real, and Pound's daughter's view is that he really did break down, during the war, in the cage at Pisa, in the mental institution. And when they let him out, there was no provision for actually treating him in any way, and that he really was, a pretty broken person by the time he got out.
I read somewhere that Donald Hall had the last interview with him where he was compos mentis and speaking more lucidly, but I haven't read it. But do you know anything about that, or what he covered?
I think that I tried to read it. It's available still through Paris Review online, but you have to subscribe to Paris Review.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody can find that. That would be good to see. But I believe that it may not be a recorded interview. It's more like an account of his visit with Ezra Pound.
I think Paul's telling us about it.
No, this is an interview from that I did with Diane DePrima, asking her specifically about her visits to Ezra Pound at St. Elizabeth. So I'm working on this book, Cascadian Prophets, the second book of transcribed interviews, and the one with Diane is in it. And I asked her about visiting Ezra Pound, and I just see again that she's talking about his generosity. He was very generous, full of stories, always willing to sit down and tell us about him and Mr. Cummings or this and that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, he stole food from the dining hall at St. Elizabeth's to give to Diane DePrima. He knew she was staying with these other poets in Washington, D.C., and he said, poets are poor. You guys got to eat. So he had stolen, she described it as like those terrible fruit salads and, biscuits and things like that. But, it's his effort. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me, to think of his life, like I said, all the way back at the beginning. If you wrote a film script of it and took it to those guys in Hollywood, they'd say, "Don't be absurd. Nobody will believe this." And then you think of like other poets of his generation. What a different kind of life. I mean, William Carlos Williams, lived in Rutherford, New Jersey, and, was a doctor and visited people's houses. Wallace Stevens worked for an insurance company. Robert Frost lived up in Vermont building fences. Mary Ann Moore lived in the Bronx and went to the zoo and went to see Yankees games with her mother. I mean, other poets of her generation, just don't have lives like that. It really is sort of an extraordinary account.
That was an amazing story. I am confused about the timing, though. Matteo said so he was 62 when he got out of St. Elizabeth, but you said he was 60 or 61 when he was caged.
I think it was 1962 he got out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so he was 17 plus 60. So he was in his late 70s when he got
out? He would have been, 62 plus 15, so he would have been 77 approximately, yeah.
Oh, God. This is heartbreaking. Has somebody told the story? Like, I mean, I find you to be a spellbinding storyteller. Is there a book that, I'm sure there's many books, but is there?
Well, there's a few good biographies. Yeah, there's a few biographies of him. They may have more of the story than you want to hear. An interesting thing I'll recommend to people, I think you can find it on YouTube. There was in the 1990s a series of PBS shows on American poets called Voices and Visions. And I'm told that the Ezra Pound is the best one, and it's the only one I've seen. But the Voices and Visions, I think Helen Vendler had something to do with it. But I think if you looked on YouTube and found it, you will hear the story pieced together by different friends and relatives of Ezra Pound, and the sort of story, it really does center on, different views of him. People who don't like him very much. James Laughlin, his publisher at New Directions. Uh, his daughter is on there. Olga Rudge is on there. Olga Rudge is great. She says things like, they would come to the house. They'd say, "We want to write about Ezra Pound, but we'll tell both sides." Then she'd say, "Both sides? What do you mean, both sides? Ezra Pound is not a pancake." So, anyhow. But, I recommend the Voices and Visions. You can, go a little deeper into it. You can also get some of the history beforehand, and some really beautiful film footage of him in old age. So it's worth looking at if you want to see something. Um, the biographies, at least the Humphrey Carpenter biography, has the long account. I don't know who wrote it, but about Allen Ginsberg visiting. That had originally been published in City Lights Journal, maybe the first City Lights Journal. And there were some late recordings of Ezra Pound. He read with other poets at different poetry festivals in Italy. So there's some other material out there. So he lived about 10 years. He died in 1972, I believe. And, maybe the only other thing to say about that is that there are quite a few different versions of the cantos out there. The major thing is that there are different orderings of the late cantos. And in particular, they found a canto written in 1944, in which he writes that this is the ultimate canto. This is the final canto. And it's a little love poem to Olga. And they didn't find that. It's not in the early versions. That was added in as the final canto. And there were also two cantos he wrote in Italian, which his family suppressed until maybe 10 years ago, because they were written in the waning years of the war, when there was a lot of misinformation. And among other things, he had heard that the Malatesta Tempio, the temple that he adored, had been bombed to pieces by the Allies. And there was a lot of stuff going around. It was their version of multiple stories and fake facts and fake news and all of that. And he wrote a couple of cantos in Italian, and those were suppressed by the family until pretty recently. They're in the current edition, the paperback edition of the cantos, the Italian cantos. Remember, I pointed out last week the mistake he made in his translation in the first one, when Tiresias greets Odysseus in the sort of Ezra Pound, and Tiresias says a second time, "Why, man of ill star?" It's like a second time to hell. So Ezra Pound thought he was writing his way out of the hell of World War I, and found himself revisiting hell in World War II. These are the kinds of things that if you wanted to turn it into a prophetic book in some way, or a book full of, predictions and prophecies and magic and mystery, there's that too.
Mm. It's quite amazing to have this background to the cantos. I'm just really appreciating it. As the tragedy of humankind in his life sort of sinks in, and the events of those times and this time, sort of resonate within me. So thank you for presenting it in this way. I appreciate that.
Yeah, nobody'd have to live that kind of life again. But the same issues are still with us. Going back to one of those hell cantos where you're in the middle of hell, and he says in big letters, and here the personnel changes. And it's like every age we could put those people in hell. Every age there are people we would stick in the hells of ice, frozen lakes, for what they're doing. And they're still doing it, today. And there's the views of paradise. There are the views of paradise also. So we have that. Well, so we had looked at Canto 18 and Canto 19. I think we won't bother to read right now, but if you want to read more about what it's like to hang around with these bankers and munitions people, you can read 19 in that way. It's got some memories of Ezra Pound in New York City, running into people who have all sorts of schemes for money making. And to keep in mind that in a way, it really goes back to, are you like a banker and a munitions person who is making money by what he calls destructive investment, or can you be clever and actually help people and make money in other ways? And so it's not like he's against investment or against money. You can't be against money. There it is. It's just partly out there. But you know destructive versus productive investment, and he came to see the destructive as being intimately tied with usury, which is to say, charging money for money, which is how most people in our world seem to make money. I mean, I can't imagine what he would have thought of cryptocurrency. I have no idea, but let's leave that aside for the moment. But let's go to page 89 and read, a slightly different view of things that, will be maybe sort of lovely. We're going to start back with you could say, a cut up from Catullus, from Homer, from the troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn, from the Italian Tuscan poet Cavalcanti, and lines from Bernard de Ventadorn's poem. But so we're going to begin here at Canto 20. Sound slender, quasi tinula, ligur aeudi sinus ve domna dom plumical. This is from a Ventadorn poem. So let's just begin. Just actually listen to it more than even worrying about what it's singing to. But you can see the word domna in there, the woman. You can see, so anyhow, sound slender, quasi tinula, ligur aerde sinus ve domna don plumical, negus vesermon bel pensar noval. Between the two almond trees flowering, the viel held close to his side, and another sadora, possum ego nature non meminisse, isum propertio aid Ovidio. The boughs are not more fresh where the almond shoots take their March green. This is a translation of his. This is a translation of Arnaud Daniel. The boughs are not more fresh where the almond shoots take their March green. And that year I went up to Freiburg, and Rennert had said, nobody knows anything about Provençal. Or if there is anybody, it's old Levi. And so I went up to Freiburg, and the vacation was just beginning. The students getting off for the summer, Freiburg im Breisgau, and everything clean, seeming clean after Italy. And I went to Old Levy, and it was by then 6:30 in the evening. And he trailed halfway across Freiburg before dinner to see two strips of Cape. Arnaud's, that's the troubadour Arnaud Daniel, Arnaud's Settant Uno or Superiore Ambrosiana. Not that I could sing him the music. And he said, "Now, is there anything I can tell you?" And I said, "I don't know, sir." "Yes, doctor. What do they mean by Neugandres?" And he said, "Neugandres, Neugandres. You know, for 6 months of my life, every night when I go to bed, I say to myself, Neugandres, eh, Neugandres. Now, what the devil can that mean?" This is such a great story, I think. He's gone to find the only guy in Europe who knows anything about Provençal, and he asks him about one word in one poem of Arnaud Daniel, and it turns out that this old levy, every night when I go to bed, I say to myself, Neugandres, Neugandres. Now, what the devil can that mean? Wind over the olive trees, ranunculi ordered. By the clear edge of the rocks, the water runs, and the wind scented with pine and with hay fields under sun swath. Agostino, Jacopo, and Bocciata, you would be happy for the smell of that place and never tired of being there, either alone or accompanied. And now suddenly we're going to go back into a translation. Sound as of the nightingale too far off to be heard. We're going back into Arnaud Daniel, and then suddenly back to Pound. Sandro and Boccato and Jacopo Salaio, the ranunculae and almonds, boughs set in espalier, Duccio, Agostino, Elolors. The smell of that place, de noi ganres. Air moving under the boughs, the cedars there in the sun, hay new cut on hill slope, and the water there in the cut between the two lower meadows. Sound, the sound, as I have said, a nightingale, too far off to be heard, and the light falls, Ramir, from her breast to thighs. Scroll back up just a little bit, Paul. We need to go a little bit higher up to the top of this page. Yeah, that's good. For 6 months of my life, every night when I go to bed, I say to myself, Neugandres, Neugandres. Now, what the devil can that mean? And then Pound has some of his, like, paradise, his views of the Mediterranean, the wind over the olive trees, the ranunculi, that's a flower there ordered by the clear edge of rocks, the water runs, and the wind scented with pine and with hay fields under sun swath. And then, several Italian artists, Agostino, Jacopo, and Bocciata. You would be happy for the smell of that place. This is really, I think, important and beautiful. You would be happy for the smell of that place and never tired of being there, either alone or accompanied. And then we're back into the poem. Sound as of the nightingale, too far off to be heard. Sandro and Boccato and Jacopo Salaio, the ranunculae and almond, boughs set in espalier, Duccio, Agostino. Now notice what happens here. Et la lors, the smell of that place. La lors is like our word odors, et la lors, the smell of that place, de noi ganres. There's our Neugandres. And he's figured out de noi ganres. Ganres means wards off. That word ennui is our word ennui. It wards off ennui or boredom. The smell of that place wards off boredom. So Pound has solved this mystery, this ancient mystery of what this old poem means right in the middle of his writing. He's shown us him going to talk with this guy. He's shown going into the poem. He's thinking of his own accounts of the Mediterranean coast, the smell of the olive trees, the hay, the ranunculi there, the almond boughs, and he suddenly gets it. Lors, the smell of that place. Der Neugamris wards off boredom. And then see where you are. You can be alone, but air moving under the boughs. That's so beautiful, I think, just to see the air moving under the boughs, the cedars there in the sun, hay new cut on a hill slope, and the water there in the cut between the two lower meadows, and back to the poem of Arnaud Daniel's sound. The sound, as I have said, a nightingale, too far off to be heard. And then a translation, and the light falls, and back to Arnaud Daniel's own Provençal, Ramir. It doesn't just fall, it ramirs, it like re-lands from her breast to thighs. He was playing there at the Pala, Parasina, two doves for an altar at the window, El Marchese stava per divenire pazzo, after it all. And that was when Troy was cut down, and they came here and cut holes in rocks down Rome way and put up the tinders and came here. Come did a destin, peace, peace, keep the peace, Borsho. And he said, some bitches sold us. That was Ganelon. They won't get another such ivory. And he lay there on the round hill under the cedar, a little to the left of the cut, Esty speaking, by the side of the summit, and he said, I have broken the horn. By God, I have broke the best ivory, Lolophons. And he said, Tan mare fustes, pulling himself over the gravel. By God, that bugger's done for. They won't get another such ivory. And they were there before the wall. Toro, Las Almenas, Nick Este speaking, under the battlement. Epipurgo, Pur de la Asla. And the king said, God, what a woman. God, what a woman, said the king, Taylor Regido. Sister, says I'm curious, see your sister. Alf left that down to Elvira, and Sancho wanted it from her. Toro and Zamora, bloody Spaniard. Nesto let her go back in the autumn. Does anybody recognize Let Her Go Back? That rhymes with Canto 2, the old men of Troy seeing Helen saying, let her go back to the ships. She'll be the end of us. Esti, go damn you, between the walls, Aris, painted look like Aris. Jungle, glazed green and red feathers, jungle, basis of renewal, renewals rising over the soul, green virid of the jungle, lozenge of the pavement, clear shapes, broken, disrupted, body eternal, wilderness of renewals, confusion, basis of renewals. Let's just stop there for a moment. If you can believe it, this was in the charges brought against Ezra Pound when he was being charged with being an anarchist. This line, right at the top, confusion, basis of renewals. They thought he wanted to overthrow the US government and have confusion instead. You don't ask the CIA to read poetry for you. Confusion, basis of renewals, subsistence, glazed green of the jungle, Zoe, Marazoya, Zotar, loud over the banners, glazed grape and the crimson, oh, Bios, Gose Eleni Vedi in the sunlight, gate cut by the shadow, and then the faceted air, floating. Below, sea churning shingle, floating, each on an invisible raft, on the high current, invisible fluid, borne over the plain, recumbent, the right arm cast back, the right wrist for a pillow, the left hand like a calyx, thumb held against finger, the third, the first fingers petaled up, the hand is a lamp, a calyx. From toe to head, the purple, blue pale smoke, as of incense, wrapped each in burnous, smoke as the olivinums, swift, as if joyous, wrapped floating, and the blue pale smoke of the incense, swift arise, then lazily in the wind as Aeolus over bean field, as hay in the sun, the olibinum, saffron, as mirror without styrax, each man in his cloth, as on raft, on the high invisible current, on toward the fall of water, and then over the cataract, in air strong, the bright flames V-shaped, nel fuoco, that's in the flame, d'amor mimisa, in the flame of love, d'amor mimisa, nel fuoco d'amor mimisa, in the flame of love, he put me. That's right out of Dante. In the flame of love, he put me. Yellow, bright saffron, croceo, as the olibinum bursts into flame. The bodies so flamed in the air took flame. Mi mise, il mio sposo novello, shot from stream into spiral. Those colors, by the way, watch always for saffron, yellow. The croceo must be a crocus, the olibinum. To Ezra Pound, those colors are always the colors of erotic love, just as blue is always the colors of time moving. And we'll see more and more of that. Now we'll come down from shot from stream into spiral, and the next stanza, or followed the water, or looked back to the flowing. Others approaching that cataract, its dawn out of shadow, the swathed cloths, now purple and orange, and the blue water dusky beneath them, pouring there into the cataract, with noise of sea over shingle, striking with ha, ha, aha, thum, thum, ah, whoa, whoa, ah, thum, bah. If anybody here has read Kerouac's magnificent Sounds of the Ocean that you get in Old Angel Midnight or in Big Sur, I'm positive this is where he got it. And if he didn't get it from here, it was in the air, because this is the sound of the sea striking the shingles with that ha, 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 dum, dum, ah, whoa, whoa, ah, dum, bah. And from the floating bodies, the incense pale blue, purple above them, shelf of the lotophagoi. Those are the lotus eaters, the lotophagoi. Ariel cut in the ether, reclining with the silver spilla, the ball as of melted amber, coiled, caught up and turned. Lotophagoi of the suave nails, quiet, scornful, voce profundo, feared neither death nor pain for this beauty, if harm to ourselves. And beneath, the clear bones, far down, thousand on thousand. What gain with Odysseus that they died in the whirlpool, and after many vain labors, living by stolen meat, chained to the rowing bench, that he should have great fame and lie by night with the goddess? Their names are not written in bronze, nor their rowing sticks set with elk pen oars, nor have they mound by seaboard, that saw never the olives under Sparta with the leaves green and then not green, the click of light in their branches, that saw not the bronze hall nor the ingle, nor lay with the queen's waiting maids, nor had they Circe to couchmate, Circe Titania, nor had they meats of Calypso, or her silk skirts brushing their thighs, Give? What were they given? Earwax, poison and earwax, and a salt grave by the bullfield. Ne son amumona, their heads like sea crows in the foam, black spotches, seaweed under lightning, canned beef of Apollo, 10 cans for a boatload. Ligur aoide. And from the plain whence the water shoot, across, back, to the right, the roads, away in the grass, the Khan's hunting leopard, and young Salustio, and Ixota, the suave turf, ac ferae familiaris, and the cars slowly, and the panthers, soft-footed, plain, as the plain of Somnus, the heavy cars as a triumph, gilded heavy on wheel, and the panthers chained to the cars. Over suave turf, the form wrapped, rose, crimson, deep crimson, and in the blue dusk, a color as of rust in the sunlight. Out a white cloud moving over the plain, head and arms curve reclining. The road back and away till cut along the face of the rock, and the cliff folds in like a curtain. The road cut in under the rock, square groove in the cliff's face, as Giostre, the columns crystal with peacocks cut in the capitals, the soft pad of beasts dragging the cars, cars slow, without creak, and at windows in inner roadside, le donne I cavalieri, the women and the cavalry, smooth face under hennin, the sleeves embroidered with flowers, great thistle of gold, or an amaranth, acorns of gold, or of scarlet, cramoisi and diaspre slashed white into velvet, crystal columns, acanthus, sirens in the pillar heads, and at last, between gilded barocco, 2 columns coiled and fluted, Vanoka leaning half naked, waist tall there behind her. Peace, Borso, Borso. Well, let's come back to the full screen. It's not exactly paradise. It's more the land of the lotus eaters. But you can really see Pound working at these various levels, working with, first the account of visiting old Levy, and then we've got Odysseus, and then we've got Arnaud Daniel's song, and then we've got his own lyric views of paradise and the colorings, and this, as one interview I saw with Diane DePrima said, why did you go visit Pound? What was it he had? She said, the precise word and the precise phrase. Be glad to take a last comment or question or something if anybody's got one. I don't know how many of you have, read repeatedly those early cantos, but this is the first canto, I think, that among other things, repeats many lines from the earlier cantos. There's quite a few of them that are beginning to reappear, and that's going to be part of the larger rhythm that he sets up, is the more you read in them, the more you see lines coming back again and again, even just words, unusual words. The saffron we just had reminds me of Canto 4 with the sandal petals, the saffron foot. You've got saffron and orchids, and we've got various blues, and we've got, the sound of the olive, and the line that really gets me, the click of light in the olive branches. I love that. This guy's like way ahead of the synesthesia that all the psychedelic people are talking about now. The click of light in the olive leaves.
sorry, Andrew. I have a quick question. Yeah,
Yeah.
you were making the point that it's not quite the paradise level. It's maybe a different level. Lotus eaters, lotus land. Does he do it? Does he have a? So he doesn't have just like Dante, like 3 levels. He has whole rungs within each level, but not mapped out. But
Not mapped out, but rungs between them. But I think he's also moving to a point of seeing that just as all times are contemporaneous in the mind,
mhm,
all places are contemporaneous in the mind. And I think that click of light in
yeah,
the branches is a moment of paradise before you pull your head out and you're back in the wars. And, this, you can read up the history of if you want, but this desperate father calling to his son, keep the peace, Borso, keep the peace. There's
mm,
like levels of, and the Lotophagi, those incredible visions of the,
yeah,
floating through the air with their left hand or the right arm, their heads in the crook of that and their right hands cupped upwards with the lotus pod in it. And yeah, we've got all sorts of things. And then the vision that, Odysseus gets home, gets famous, but what happened to his men, this is where Pound gets so colloquial, canned beef of Apollo, 10 cans for a boatload. If you remember, his men stole
some
the
pigs.
cattle of Apollo and ate it because they were starving and hadn't had meat for a long time. And I think it's Pound who's saying canned beef for Apollo. What was it? They took 10 cans worth of meat
Mm,
and the boatload of them died for that. So he's mixing up funny commentary. It's very literary, but it's also, kind of remarkably written. And this is one of the most interesting places to me as a translator where we see him figuring out the Arnaud Daniel he's translating, and we see him figuring it out in the poem
mhm.
and moving
Beautiful.
back and forth with the imagery, the almond boughs, the olive boughs, the light falling through, the love poem of it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul.
So Andrew, you're talking about how Pound was using the act of writing to figure something out. To paraphrase William Carlos Williams, I write to figure out what I think, right? And this is a technique that we know that happens. But also, this is writing projectively. He's in the moment, and these are some of the roots of what Olson would call projective verse. So, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, when Olson wrote projective verse, and then it was quoted extensively by William Carlos Williams in Williams's autobiography, Williams said Olson was naming something we'd been doing for a long time. And the gratitude to Olson was he not only named it, but described it. And if you go back to that, I think it's in that essay, Projective Verse. Olson says that he thinks like the first great example of projective verse is actually Pound's translation of the no play Hagoromo, which would have been done in around 1915, 1916. So by the time we get to this Canto 20, this is quite a few years later, and Pound has not only worked with multiple time frames, the sense of you discover things through writing and you don't go back and necessarily correct the adventure, but when Olson publishes his essay, that's in 1949, so that would be effectively a generation later than Pound was doing this.
Right. Thank you. I think Roxy has her hand.
Another question. Is it too
Sure.
late to ask
Yeah.
one? Okay. I'm wondering if you I don't know if Matteo could help here as a therapist, but I feel that he is doing something to my mind through his vorticist strategies, or maybe it's your reading strategies. I don't know, but I feel that his layering of temporalities and his I almost think of, Kristen Prevalet's kind of trance work. I feel like I'm going into a kind of hypnotized state of reverie, listening to these long, beautiful lyrical spiraling of images that include the sonic, the click, of the light and the branches and the air and the smell, the new definitions of the image, which includes a full body experience. And then on top of that, he's layering these different historical epic moments, which otherwise would be very prosaic. And I'm wondering if you think he's almost softening our minds into something that resembles a dream state to absorb the meaning of these layered histories in a new way.
I think you're
Spiraling
absolutely
way.
right. I think this is maybe like a really underdeveloped aspect of how we read poetry. And one thing that Ezra Pound often said was that poetry transports you. But what nobody pays attention to is like, where do you get transported to? So you just told us where you're getting transported to. And I think that's, actually a very beautiful thing. And I think we don't really have a vocabulary, but there's no doubt he's doing it through repeated sounds and rhythms. And I think, if you could dig up old Ezra's bones at the moment and say, how should we read your poem now? He would probably say, just listen to it. Just listen to the rhythms, listen to the sounds. Don't pay attention to what it says. Listen to the music of it. Matthew, I see you're talking.
I was going to say Kerouac or James Joyce. Like you said Kerouac before, but I was hearing a lot of James Joyce in that play. But all with that Mediterranean light, with the, just his attention to light and color and air is intense, and the way that interplays. It's very atmospheric, and the sound.
Yeah, there is something, beautiful about it. And I don't know enough about the prosody involved, but he was trying to write with the old classical syllabics in mind. And I don't really know enough about syllabic writing as opposed to, writing that has stress and unstressed. But, you get the feeling that some of the hypnotic quality, it's not like percussive. It's not like, it's more like listening to free jazz than it is like listening to rock and roll.
Yeah, Ginsberg goes into is using quantitative verse, meaning the vowels. It's all assonance, and the length of the vowels is what he's really playing around with. And there's more than we normally hear or read.
Yeah, quantitative. Yeah, that's another term for syllabic, basically. That it's
Yeah.
it's the lengths of the syllables, really. Yeah, long and short syllables rather than stressed and unstressed syllables. But you can see this is a difficult canto. How many languages are in it? So far, luckily, there's only, Romance languages, Old Provençal, Dante's Italian, breaking away a little bit into modern Italian, but you've also got to be able to hear, the sort of Ezra Pound voice of what were they given? Earwax, poison and earwax, which is, of course, the wax that the guys on Odysseus's ship had to stick in their ears so they didn't hear the sirens singing. This is all Odysseus there. And, somehow we've got the leopards and the cats of Canto 2, but they're drawing a cart that belongs to the Khan, who is, of course, out there printing his money up, as we just saw in Canto 18, out of mulberry, pulp.
And your message to me only went to me, but if you could tell it, Andrew, that'd be awesome. Ann Graham Walker. She said, "Thank you so much, Andrew. Your telling of Ezra's story was profoundly moving." She sent it to me as a direct message, but I asked her to send it to all, and I don't know if she can find her mute button. She's working on an iPad. So we're at 5:06. So I don't know how you want to wrap this up. There we go. She sent it to everybody now. And I feel the same way. It's just this compassion. You know, last week it was a 400-mile walk to see his daughter, and then I was editing my interview with Diane DePrima yesterday, and again DePrima noting Ezra's generosity, and then you noting again what she said about the quality of, you know, each image that he had, and and talk about luminous details. You know, he had them. I mean, that phrase is associated with him. I guess he put it in the ABCs of reading. So a tremendous, and I think Roxy, very, very astute. And I'm having these experiences of very, very deep compassion for him, and you're telling of it as expert. It's just such a gift to have you be able to do this for us. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Paul. You know, I think we've got almost a 3-week gap now because we don't pick back up until January 7th. And, you know, I suggest now's a really great time to watch that Voices and Visions, you know, video if you can find it. It's only 45 minutes or something. You know, it was originally a TV show meant to be squished into an hour. But also go where you want. You know, it does not hurt to go back and read. We've effectively gone through 20 cantos, though I know we missed 3 of them. But, you know, to go back and reread those. If you want to push forward, that's great. There's still a long ways to go before the piece on cantos. And if you want to jump right into those, the beauty and the pathos of those, but you know, they'll be much, much richer if you've been through everything beforehand. And at the same time, it's a book that you can read in multiple directions, multiple places, going in and out of it. So don't feel like you somehow have to grok it from front to back. You can go in at many different places, but do keep track for yourself of what I've called those, you know, islands of, you know, meaning, whatever meaning is, not like necessarily logical meaning. The places you find beauty, the places you find something that moves you, the places that you find a line, an image, a sound, a passage, a page, a whole canto, you know, and particularly notice how he moves back and forth. Maybe you're starting to see now how the greatest hits approach doesn't do it. You know, you can't have paradise without having the armaments manufacturers. You know, you can't listen to the click of light in the olive boughs without having Odysseus's men going down in a whirlpool because they ate Apollo's beef. You know, it's all going to be coming at you in these ideogrammic ways, and you know, there's not a didactic way to say it, but feeling the changes, feeling the voices, you know, the points where Pound's own voice steps in, where the translations come in, where suddenly, you know, the voices of Dante and Arnaud Daniel and Homer and Catullus, Sappho's in there, you know, all these people are just surfacing.
Well, Zach Charles appears to have gotten the right link on YouTube. I looked earlier, and he believes that's it. So I'm going to put that as a link. It can't be embedded because of the specifics. So I'll link to that. It'll be on the Cantos page, and the this week's video will be on there as soon as it's produced and exported and uploaded, which is a process. But I think that's probably a good ending point for today. Andrew, what do you think?
One last question from Anne out there. Let her comment. Let Anne say a last word.
No, I just reading all this, I really am wondering, and maybe you know, how many languages did Ezra Pound actually, you know, I don't know if he could speak them all, but did he, you know, could he translate and move around in?
Well, he lived a long time in both France and Italy. I have no doubt he was
Yeah.
completely fluent in Italian, as whatever that means. But also keep in mind that, one of the things he says that's been very important for me, you don't need to know a whole language to translate a poem.
Oh,
In other words, like I translate classical Sanskrit poetry, but I don't need to know how to say, can you tell me where the men's room is?
mhm.
It's there's a way in which you can work a lot with a poetic tradition. So I think a lot, but I think these Provençal languages he knew really well. Old Provençal, Spanish, Italian, and French.
Yeah, and he also knew older forms of Italian that are more like Latin. And what about Chinese?
He worked at it for his whole adult life, basically. I doubt he ever had anyone to speak it with.
Yeah, amazing.
Yep. Well, thanks everybody. Have safe and lovely, winter solstice journey the next few weeks. And I think we'll see you all. Do I have the date right, Paul? It's January 7th. We all reconvene.
Yeah, we're going to miss Christmas Eve, which is 1 week from today. We're going to miss New Year's Eve, which is 2 weeks from today. And so 3 weeks from today. That means the 7th, a Sunday, 3 to 5 Pacific time. And then we have 3 more weeks and then we're done. And we could pick up the discussion about continuing if people want to do that. We'll have that discussion certainly by week 8. So think about that. And Andrew, huge gratitude. This is amazing. Thank you all for making this possible and for supporting this work. This is just astounding and just a beautiful thing. I'm very grateful.
Vision.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks
Thank
to both
you.
of you. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow.
Yeah, I'm going to put the link
Thank you.
that Zach put in the chat. I'm going to get that on the website right away, but it'll be a link. It won't be embedded, so you'll have to click on it, but it should work fine.
Mille grazie.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye. Happy
Bye-bye.
holidays, everybody.
Arrivederci. There's a few other phrases I picked up in Italian when growing up in Chicago, but I don't think many of them are.
I know my Sanskrit students always want me to teach them the swear words.
Yeah. No.
I feel
Beautiful.
like I need a Pound support group now. I feel a little wrecked by the story of him.
I'm a little wrecked too. Go ahead, Matteo.
Hey, I have an off. I'm always wrecked, so I share his wreckage with him. But my question, I'm about to go to Morocco, and I wanted to ask Andrew or anyone else if there's a Pound Arabic connection that I could home in on before.
Oh,
Habib.
yes. Yes, there is. Just very, very briefly, which is, see if I can find it here. Cantos 24 to 26, there is an account of, I believe he takes a little trip over maybe to Morocco from Spain, and he visits a synagogue
Okay.
with a guy named, I think, Mustafa. And he loves the synagogue. He tells a rip-roaring kind of story about it. I can't remember which of those 24 to 26 cantos, but look through that. And there's and there's also an account of him wanting to talk to a camel driver about religion.
Great, I love it, because I mean, there's an obvious connection between Andalusia, Maghreb, and North Africa, and the Provençal poets. But he doesn't seem to go into that too deeply. But I'm going to look into 24, 26 and check that out. Yeah.
There's also a poet in Agadir, El Habib Luai, who has translated into Arabic some beat poets. I think he's translated a bit of Michael McClure's work. He visited Michael. He visited Sam Hamill. Was friends with Michael Rothenberg, and he lives in Agadir. And if you're on Facebook, you could find him on Facebook. I think he's on the regular.
Yeah, how do you spell his name? El Habib Luai?
El Habib Luai. I believe it's ELHABIBLOUIE, something like that.
Okay,
But
I'll look him up. I'll poke around. Yeah.
In Mackey's essay, Nathaniel Mackey's essay, which has been variously titled, but Cante Moro,
Okay.
anthologized in sound states. I don't know if you can get a PDF online, but it really does go into the Arabic, I guess, diasporic influences in Spain of these different cultures coming together, creating a kind of generally orphaned state of the gypsy, which he kind of parallels to what Lorca observed when he came to the United States, of the African American experience.
Yeah.
The Sigh of the Moor, isn't that the poem? The Sigh of the Moor.
That's the title of the poem, The Sigh of the Moor.
I think that's the one.
Oh, okay, beautiful. Thank you, guys. Well, wish me luck out there.
Yeah, wish you luck. Have fun in Morocco. Sounds terrific.
Oh, I will. I'll be safe. See you guys in 2 weeks.
See you, Roxy. Good to see you, Paul. Amy. Talk to you later.